So we'll get started in a moment. At the beginning, I would like to flag that the Q&A tab is available at any point during this talk. I encourage you to ask questions or drop your questions pertaining to the talk, but really anything else, it's available from the beginning onwards. It's 12:03. I think we can get started. So hello and welcome to the second event in the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series from Arihanta Institute. I will be your host today. My name is Jonathan Dickstein, and I am professor at Arihanta and also the academic lead for our Vegan Studies initiative. So some of you may be new to Arihanta Institute, so I would like to share a few words about what we do here. Arihanta Institute's mission is to build a world-class online institution for deeper learning of the Jain tradition, its principles, and how these principles apply to daily life for the benefit and well-being of individuals and society. We offer a robust and growing curriculum of self-paced online courses on various aspects of the Jain tradition. We also host conferences, speakers, a blog, a new podcast, all to share content on Jainism, Jain studies, and related topics. Now, one well-known expression of Jain values is through its millennia-long practice of vegetarianism, and increasingly so towards veganism. This is one reason why, with encouragement from members of the Jain community, we developed the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta. The Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series is one part of the initiative's programming, with the other two educational components being a master's degree concentration at Claremont School of Theology and multi-hour online courses in vegan studies. Much more can be found on our website. Now, as for the series itself, the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series takes place on the first of every month through 2024, except during June and July, when we host 3 talks. Today's event will be followed in 2 weeks on July 1st by a talk from well-known advocate Ed Winters, otherwise known as Earthling Ed. His talk, How to Talk About Dairy, involves how to think and speak about the phenomenon of using animals for milk and milk products. Then, 2 weeks after this talk, on July 15th, Dr. Cheryl Abate from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, will speak on new ethical issues in contemporary veganism. This talk takes on the ethics of consuming arguably non-sentient organisms, the ethics of eating discarded animal products, and other intriguing and at times controversial issues. So mark that on your calendars, July 1st and July 15th. Yes. So now for today's event. Toward a Plant-Based Food System features Professor Jan Dutkiewicz. Dr. Dutkiewicz is assistant professor in the School of Social Science and Cultural Studies at the Pratt Institute in New York and a contributing writer at Vox. He has written about the politics of food for the New Republic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Wired, and The Wall Street Journal. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker to the Voices in Vegan Studies series. Dr. Dutkiewicz is a crucial voice in discussions about how to get us moving globally away from animal inputs and towards a vegan horizon. Thank you for being here, Dr. Dutkiewicz.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. As Jonathan said, throughout my talk, if you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A. We'll leave ample time at the end, and I'm happy to address any questions and go deeper into any of the points I'm going to make. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we can get going. All right. So this is a brief outline of what I'm going to talk to you about today. First, I'm going to introduce to you food systems analysis. Food systems analysis is an approach for understanding the multifaceted, multivariate ways that food is actually produced and ends up on our plates, and understanding the various impacts that it has. I'm then going to spend the bulk of the talk actually about the various impacts of a meat-centric food system and explain its various environmental, social, political, and economic impacts and harms. I'm then going to, as a foil to that, explain the various benefits of a plant-based food system and a plant-based diet or a primarily plant-based diet. I'll then turn to the question of how we can feed the world as a whole more safely and more sustainably. And finally, I'm going to just map out a few strategies for achieving this goal. So what is a food system? The term gets thrown around a lot, and you'll often hear it in the context of people finding something they don't like about the food system and saying that the food system is quote unquote broken. So here's just a small smattering of Google results for food system. Now, I think this is sort of an easy way to think about things not working. You look at, be it factory farms or negative health outcomes, and you say, oh, the food system is broken. Well, I actually think that that's not a very smart and it's not a very productive way of approaching food system analysis. Because not that the food system is broken, food is quite readily available. It's relatively cheap, especially in a place like the United States. Food system value chains are actually relatively robust. It's just that the food system also creates a number of harms. So I think a better question when approaching food system is to not just say that it's broken, because it really depends on how you define our food system and broken. So rather, it's much more of a question of asking what works and what doesn't, where in the food system, and for whom. So when I say the food system is complex, I'm talking about this image or something like it. There are a number of attempts out there to sketch out what a food system consists of. I really like this one. It's from Nourish, which is a food NGO. And what it does is it breaks down all the aspects of the food system as falling into 4 meta categories that you can see here, which is farming, environmental, social, and economic. And within those particular categories, such as the biological system, the economic system, the health system, the political system, and the various aspects of the social system that drive demand for food. So it's not like food just gets produced by farmers and then through the sort of apolitical, impersonal, invisible hand of the market, supply meets demand and consumers buy it. That's absolutely not how it works. And so understanding how anything from a carrot to a slab of beef is produced, the impact it has, the inputs it requires, the people who stand to profit and benefit from it, the people who are harmed by it, requires taking a slightly deeper and slightly more piecemeal, if you will, approach based on this sort of analysis. And throughout my talk today, I'm going to keep referring back to this schema and to this image to walk you through the food system and the various harms that it may present. Excuse me, an animal-based food system, which of course is a huge part of our food system. So as a rough set of heuristics for analyzing food system impacts and the impacts and potential harms of particular food, there are a number of of course, the list is actually infinite, but for our purposes, there are a number of shorthands that we can use and a number of key issues we can look at. I've broken these down into environmental, farming, social and political and economic, tracking that food system map. If we're looking at the environmental impact of any food, be it a soybean or a carrot or a piece of chicken or a piece of beef, we generally look at 5 basic environmental impacts. Land use, so how much land is required to produce a certain weight or a certain amount of a given food. Water use, eutrophication, which is to say pollution of waterways, greenhouse gas emissions, and impacts on biodiversity. If we look at farming impacts, we're often looking at impacts on labor, the conditions under which laborers work, and the form of work they're doing, and the potential harms caused by that work. And we're also looking at impact on rural communities. In terms of social and political impacts, number one, we'll look at public health impacts, so communicable and non-communicable disease, which is to say dietary-based health impacts, and also the impact of food production systems, qua food production systems, not just in terms of people who eat a given food. The use of funds to produce food, the impact of producers and producer groups on regulators, questions of education, and finally, on the economic side, we look at what a given permutation of forms of food production, food consumption, how those are linked to distribution of power and income within the food system. And today I'm primarily going to focus on the environmental aspects of meat production. Meat, as you might know, has an absolutely outsized impact when we're talking about any of those harms in any of those issue areas that I've just mentioned. Starting with greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a breakdown from Our World in Data of the total global emissions. The food system here accounts for, depending on which data you look at, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And livestock and fish farm production, and land used for livestock, and crops used for animal feed make up an absolutely disproportionate amount of those greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to direct livestock production, quite a bit of that comes from methane. Methane, of course, is a very fast-warming greenhouse gas that's produced by ruminants like cows or sheep in their stomachs, in their rumen, their multi-chambered stomachs, when they digest food, which they then belch out. We can also see that if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product, absolutely the worst offenders are ruminants because of all that methane. And if you look at the rest of these top emitters, virtually all are animal-based products. Now, I want to pause here and give you what I think is one important takeaway for thinking about the environmental impacts of food products, and that is that it is what is produced and not how it is produced or where it is produced that matters most. Of course, there's variations. I'm not trying to suggest that there's no variation between food products, but it's absolutely at the core of it a question of what is produced. So if you're trying to produce beef, you have to use cows, and those cows will inherently have a larger greenhouse gas impact by virtue primarily of methane emissions, but also things like the requirements for feed if those cows are raised on feedlots, than non-rumen animals for one, and plant-based products second. If we look at land use, continuing with this theme that's going to recur throughout my talk of the absolutely outsized impact, or what the geographer Tony Weiss calls the ecological hoofprint of animal-based food production, is land use. In the United States alone, about 40% of the contiguous United States is used for feeding livestock, and that includes well over 500,000 acres of land used for pasture and range, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 acres used exclusively for livestock feed crops. If we scale this up to the global level, just to give you an idea, globally we use a land area about the size of all of North and South America combined just to produce meat. And for comparison, we use a land area roughly the size of China to produce all crops that feed humans. Then, of course, there's the question of water use. Remember those rough heuristics for understanding environmental impact that I showed you a few slides ago. Animal-based agriculture requires a tremendous amount of water. And this is water that is used both directly to be delivered to animals, be it animals that are free-ranging, but of course, we know that in countries like the United States, most animals are not free-ranging. According to USDA statistics, about 99% of chickens, somewhere around 97% of pigs are raised on factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations, which are operations where they're confined indoors for the entirety of their lives. And when it comes to beef, of course, all beef cattle will graze at some point in their lives, but the vast majority of commercially raised cattle will spend the last few months of their lives being fattened for slaughter at feedlots, which are basically industrialized enclosed spaces. So not quite factory farms, but very much the same industrialized model. Anywhere you have animals that are not ranging freely, you need to feed them. You need to produce feed. Most of this feed comes from grains such as corn and soy, and in the case of ruminants, hays like alfalfa. So just to give you one particularly stark example, as you may know, the Colorado River, the great river of the American West, is quickly running out of water. Some of this has to do with climate change and drought, and a lot of it has to do with what the water in the Colorado is used for. So normally when the Colorado River the Colorado River water shortage is covered, people talk about things like, well, how much water is used by major metropolitan areas like Denver or like Phoenix. But the fact of the matter is that these cities, even though they're home to millions of people, actually use a very small percentage of water, while about 70% of all the water in the Colorado is used for agricultural purposes, much of that to grow animal feed, including hays like alfalfa. So alfalfa alone is responsible for about a third of all water withdrawals from the Colorado. Of course, this is quite irrational and also quite unsustainable. But this is the scale of impacts that we're talking about here. Of course, there are other impacts such as you see in the picture of the right, deforestation and land clearing. If you want to grow animals or you want to grow crops to feed animals, you need land. Where are you going to get that land from? Well, historically, you get that land through deforestation. This is the history of American food production, but it's also in the case very much in places like the Amazon, which is where this picture is from. And of course, you also have the whole question of eutrophication and water pollution, which also is very much inherent, especially in an industrial system where animals quite simply create more effluent, create more feces, and in that feces more nitrogen than the soil can absorb. So if you're producing animals at an industrial scale on feedlots, on factory farms, you're going to have to deal with things like, and this is the picture on the left here, like manure lagoons. This extremely stark photo is not actually color corrected. This is a satellite image taken by the artist Mishka Henner of feedlots in Texas. So all of those squares are pens. All of those little tiny white dots are cows. And that giant green lagoon is, yes, a lagoon of those cows' manure, where it's stored and where, as it breaks down, it will generate methane. And as is often the case, it can leach into groundwater, causing impacts such as not just water pollution for human populations, but fish kill, algal blooms, and other impacts on biodiversity. And then there are just basic things like run-of-the-mill air pollution. This is a graph of all the deaths caused by air pollution caused by agriculture per year in the United States. As we can see, the vast majority of that comes from the production of animal-based foods. The vast majority of that comes remember that manure lagoon from a graph ago, from livestock waste, including confinement, handling, and storage. And that's just the environmental part. Of course, I won't delve into it at length. I think other speakers in the speaker series might do so, but it's undeniable that there are tremendous animal welfare issues, especially in industrial systems. Industrialized systems operate on the logic of maximizing the throughput of animals, so maximizing the scale at which animals are produced and doing so as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Now, in that economic calculus that treats animals basically like widgets, one of the first things that falls out is giving animals space, literally physical space to engage in natural behaviors or even basic necessities, like in some cases, turning around. Of course, there are tremendous impacts on labor as well, some of which have to do quite simply with poorly regulated production. I don't want to suggest that, and I'll get back to this later in my talk, that a plant-based food system would instantly be a utopia. But there are some particular jobs that are inherent to animal food production, such as, for instance, slaughterhouse work. We know that workers who work at slaughterhouses suffer extremely high rates. According to OSHA statistics, some of the highest rates of workplace injury in the United States. This has to do with the nature of the work itself, extremely rapid work, lots of sharp instruments, extremely close proximity to other people. We know, for instance, that during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the sites where there was the most spread of virus was in slaughterhouses. We also know that work at processing facilities, even people who are not actually working on the slaughter line, killing animals, cutting animals apart, can be extremely hurt, especially where regulations are lax. If you were following the news a few months ago, you may have seen exposés in the New York Times and the Washington Post about underage, or excuse me, so that's technically not true, about teenage workers who were working night shifts at processing plants, doing things like using caustic chemicals to clean surfaces or cleaning sharp processing implements, who were hurt and maimed. I caught myself there because of the nature of labor law in the United States. Workers who might be underage for work in other sectors of the economy can actually work legally in agriculture. And of course, this all has impacts on regulation as well. A basic rule of economics and political economy in liberal democracies like the United States is that there will be some degree of regulatory capture, which is to say that large-scale business interests will use lobbying and will rely on their size to basically pressure regulators to get their way, to be perhaps less regulated than other industries or than the public interest might suggest they should be. So just to give you one example from California, California has quite robust methane emissions regulations. So if you produce anything and you emit greenhouse gases or methane, you have to report that to the state. A glaring omission is methane produced by feedlots, because dairy farms and feedlot owners pressured the government in order to not have their operations treated like industrial operations and therefore exempt them from these greenhouse gas reporting standards, even though independent research has shown that actually California's top methane emitter is not a natural gas producer, for instance, but is actually a giant feedlot in the Imperial Valley. And of course, this extends to industry, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A because this is actually where a lot of my research is, but it's a relatively small part of my talk. But this extends to opposing the democratic decisions of Americans and American voters and citizens. So, for instance, in 2018, California's voters voted on Proposition 12, which would basically regulate how certain animals, such as egg-laying chickens, such as pigs, whose meat, eggs were sold in California, were treated. Most Americans, I should say, when actually given the option to say how they think animals should be treated, will be quite humane, right? So Proposition 12, which is placed on the ballot in California, passes overwhelmingly, especially overwhelmingly for a ballot initiative. And the meat industry immediately starts challenging it in court, right? So Prop 12 is challenged on constitutional grounds by the National Pork Producers Council and the Farm Bureau. It's challenged in California, where it loses. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court actually found for California's voters, but it was close, right? And it could have gone either way. And so it's not just that meat production itself is inherently harmful, but it also creates an industry that, like any industry, will champion its interests. But in this particular case, championing its interests means supporting policies that go against the public interest in things like greenhouse gas emissions reporting, things like the democratic will of voters to change how animals are treated, and so on and so forth. And finally, I think it bears noting the widespread health effects of meat production and consumption. Specifically, processed red meat has been shown to be carcinogen, as reported by the World Health Organization. So that's those non-communicable diseases that I mentioned earlier. Consumption of these products has been shown to have negative effects. These negative effects, of course, don't just affect individuals, but they affect those individuals' families, societies, and healthcare costs in the aggregate. And equally worryingly are those communicable diseases. So we know that industrial animal agriculture is one of the primary risk vectors for the spread of zoonotic diseases, which are those diseases that can be transmitted from animal hosts to human hosts. And currently, we're seeing this with the spread of H5N1 bird flu. So for those of you who have not been following this, H5N1 is a bird flu that has been circulating globally for a long time, but since the start of the 2020s, it has ramped up, traveling globally through wild bird populations carrying it to industrial bird populations, so to factory farms. These viruses strengthen and sort of spread among populations on factory farms. They can then spread again via wild bird hosts. But what's happened over the last few years is that this disease has started mutating. It started affecting mammals, including wild mammals. We know that there have been deaths of animals like seals and penguins from bird flu, but we also know that bird flu has found its way to cattle and dairy cow populations, including in close to 20 states in the United States. And there have now been human cases of bird flu. So I'm flagging this not in the interest of fear-mongering, although I think this is an issue we should absolutely keep our eyes on, but just to show that it's not, when it comes to the production of any good, we need to look at a broad range of food system impacts, right? And over and over and over again, what we see is that the production of animal-sourced foods, meat, dairy, eggs, have an outsized impact: environmental, political, and public health. So why are we here? How should we understand this? Well, going back again to the geographer Tony Weiss, he terms the global spread of mass scale industrial meat production meatification. And what meatification does is it foregrounds animals and their meat and the inputs to produce those animals, so primarily monocrop seeds, grains, oil seeds. So this sort of new value chain starts undergirding so much of the global food system, and that's where many of these impacts come from. Now, meat production has such large impacts for two reasons, just to put a fine point on things that I've already said. The inherent impact of production, it's what you produce that matters most when looking at impact, and on a kilogram by kilogram or pound by pound basis, the largest impact, be it land use, be it emissions, be it water use, be it potential public health threats, comes from animals. And it's also the scale of production that matters. So it's how much you produce of what that determines aggregate impact. Well, we got here in large part through, unfortunately, American industrial ingenuity, right? So the birth of, for instance, the modern industrial slaughterhouse, an image of which you see here, was very much the product of turn of the 20th century. So about a century and a quarter ago, places like Cincinnati and Chicago centralized animal slaughter, turning animal slaughter from a sort of artisanal local affair into a question of very much a sort of Fordist, proto-Fordist assembly line system, where large amounts of animals were brought to a centralized large slaughterhouse where low-skilled laborers working repetitive jobs could produce standardized cuts of meat, which would then be shipped around the country. Once this was in place, the industry could be controlled by a small number of large companies that would control processing and distribution. So if you've read Upton Sinclair's classic, The Jungle, you very much know thank you, Jonathan, for dropping those links in the chat. You very much know this story. This was, of course, met starting in about the 1920s through to the 1970s with advances in breeding technology and farming technology that allowed for the concentration of animal farming. So animal processing and slaughter was industrialized first, and animal farming followed. This entire industry, I think it bears saying, it's not like the people who work in this industry are, inherently evil or trying to cause widespread harms. What they are business people following the basic logic of business, which is increase efficiency, lower costs, increase output, increase sort of the customer base in order to increase sales. But that basic logic of scaling and efficiency is what leads to so many of these externalities that we talked about. It's also an increasingly global problem. As I just said, it's what you produce that matters most. It's then how much you produce of what that determines aggregate impact. And so from everything we know, we should actually be producing far less meat, but that's not the way the trend lines are going. Globally, we're seeing a massive uptick in animal-sourced food production and consumption. Roughly, we know that this has to do with growing per capita GDP. For a number of reasons, we can maybe discuss in the Q&A. As per capita GDP goes up, people spend more money on meat. And that means that this process of meatification is only intensifying and increasing, and as are its impacts globally. But there's a sort of sad kicker here, which is that all of this production efficiency has made producing a whole lot of animals cheaper, relatively speaking, for producers, and cheaper to buy, relatively speaking, for consumers. But what it hasn't done is actually achieved something like a rational efficiency of turning the amount of calories and protein we can produce globally into edible food for humans. Why is that? It's because, again, it's what you produce that matters most. Animals have to consume calories and protein in order to stay alive and grow. And we know that there is no animal that will produce a higher output of protein and calories than the amount of protein and calories that they consume. Meaning that if you look at the opportunity food loss, which is how much of feed, the calories and protein and feed are actually lost before you get a final product. You see that with a product like beef, you're actually losing something like 96% of all protein that cow is fed before you actually get the beef. Scaled to a global picture, as we see here, more than 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces just 18% of food calories and 37% of protein. So globally farmed animal production only produces 18% of calories, 37% of protein, while having vastly sort of mismatched impacts, right? So it's an industry that ostensibly is designed to efficiently feed the world, but it actually does so very inefficiently and with very high impacts. All right, so what are the benefits of a plant-based food system? And the answer quite simply is producing and eating plants. That's the benefit right there. Am I serious? Yes, I'm actually serious. And this is not a qualitative opinion. This is just a basic matter of the science and food production. Across all significant metrics we use to evaluate the impact of food production, plant-based foods have significantly lower impact than animal-based foods. And eating plants directly, or even processing them into other products, like for instance, plant-based proteins, is inherently more efficient than cycling those plants through animals. In other words, it makes a lot more sense if we care about any of the impact that I've talked about today. If we want to reduce those impacts or eliminate them to the extent possible, it makes sense to quite simply not grow crops to feed to animals and just grow crops to feed directly to humans. So just to give you a few examples of what that looks like, let's revisit this graph from Our World in Data. Previously, when we talked about this graph, we looked at that top end. We looked at all those extremely highly emitting products: beef, lamb, cheese, so on and so forth. But let's look at the bottom of that graph. Let's look at those extremely low emitting products and see what we find. Well, we find staple crops that we could absolutely, that we already eat, for one. So it's not a question of reinventing the wheel, that we already eat, that people globally already eat, that actually in many parts of the world represent the vast majority of both calorie and protein intake per capita. And as the graph says, this, the CO2 and equivalent emissions for most plant-based products are as much as 10 to 50 times lower than most animal-based products. A study that was published in Nature Food, which is basically an imprint of the venerable science journal Nature that's dedicated to food science and food policy, compared the impact across the various environmental metrics I've talked to you about today between high consuming meat eaters, lower consuming meat eaters, vegetarians, and vegans. And it found, unsurprisingly, this shouldn't surprise you at this point in the talk, that the people who ate, the less meat you ate, the lower your environmental impact, and that in the aggregate, vegans had about a quarter of the GHG emissions of any of the dietary groups that were studied. And it's not quite as stark with things like land use and water use, but across every metric, a vegetarian and vegan diet is a clear winner over a high meat diet. This also applies to basic questions of production. So if you revisit the slide that I talked about earlier, which looks at deaths from air pollution from various forms of agricultural production in the United States, that same paper. And just as an aside, if people are interested, I can share a source list for everything that I'm talking about. So I can share the original sources. I can share that file with Jonathan. He can maybe mail it around if you're interested. So that same paper projected how we could reduce deaths from air pollution. And it found that sort of eat Lancet diet or a vegetarian diet, and especially a vegan diet, could massively reduce the mortality related to air pollution from production. With a vegan diet or producing to feed a vegan diet could reduce mortality from air pollution from agricultural production by 83%. So options for keeping the food system within environmental limits. One of the most cited academic articles about food production of the last 20, 30 years modeled a tremendous number of scenarios for keeping food production without environmental limits, without overshooting land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions. And it ultimately found that no matter what other interventions we use, be they technological interventions, management of food waste, different socioeconomic development pathways, we can't keep the food system within environmental limits without going to a low or no animal product-based diet. So no matter what else we require dietary change, and we require changes in production systems to meet a dietary change towards a primarily plant-based food system. And it's really as simple as that. The second set of benefits, and this may seem equally obvious, but it's very important to note, the second set of benefits of a plant-based food system include not the producing plants part, but the not producing animals part, right? So by not producing animals, you eliminate the harms and risks inherent to animal-based foods that simply don't exist in plant-based food production. So a primarily plant-based food system, or any food system that simply produces plants, right, doesn't involve factory farms and slaughterhouses and all the harms, be it harms to labor or environmental harms associated with that. It massively reduces the risk of zoonotic disease spillover. No factory farms, far fewer vectors for the spread of zoonotic disease. And it reduces health risks. So not just the health risks, for instance, from air pollution that I talked about, but also health risks from the consumption of processed animal-based food. So you keep the plants, you don't feed them to animals, you feed them directly to people, you take out the animals, and across every metric we've talked about, you massively reduce the harms, the environmental harms, the harms to animals, and the social and health harms associated with our current animal-forward food system. Now, I think it's worth in this context to talk about this question of feeding the world. Often when we talk about food systems, one of the big questions that comes up is, but how do we feed everyone? And then people who are champions of plant-based food systems will say, well, we just got to create a plant-based food system, and that'll just help us with feeding the world. And I think that comes with a big asterisk. I think not all food systems issues, that's the nature of food systems analysis, can be addressed with the plant-based food systems. I think it can help, but I think it doesn't quite get us there. And so I just wanted to briefly touch on this point before talking about actually a few solutions that get us towards a plant-based food system. So the first thing here is, look, if we want to quote unquote feed the world, the question is not a question of production. We already produce enough calories and protein per capita in the aggregate to feed everyone in the world a healthy diet. It's just a question of A, we don't necessarily produce the most efficient foods, and B, they're not distributed correctly. So not everyone who needs them gets them, right? So we have large parts of the world where people are undernourished or malnourished, right? And we also have large parts of the world where people at the same time are undernourished, but also suffer food-related health issues such as obesity. Now, would switching to a plant-based food system help us address this? Well, it might help us, for instance, by actually producing food far more efficiently. So not having these sort of global caloric and protein losses from producing all those crops fed to animals and producing all those animals. So we lose those inefficiencies. But it doesn't address the distribution question, which is primarily a political question. And I think that that's very important to note. So it's not like, even if we could wave a magic wand, create a plant-based food system, we wouldn't necessarily address these issues because these are issues of income and distribution. So when we're talking about feeding the world or food security, we're talking about these four things traditionally, these traditional four pillars. I'm not going to delve into them, although we can talk about them more in the Q&A, but we're talking about availability. Is sufficient food available to people? Do people have access to that food if it's available? Do they know how to use that food, right, in order to create healthy, nutritious meals? And is that food access stable, right? And so determining this, so as questions of availability, access have a lot to do with the stability of global trade, the absence of issues like civil strife or war, and things like per capita income. One of the biggest determinants of food security is quite simply whether or not people have enough money and a high enough minimum wage that they can purchase sufficient and healthful foods. A fifth pillar, however, introduced recently by scholars, is that all of these questions of food security, food production must be sufficient in quantity and quality to feed the global population without unacceptable environmental impacts. And addressing those unacceptable environmental impacts, so ensuring that those first four pillars can be done sustainably over the long term, would absolutely be improved by switching to a plant-based food system. So a plant-based food system facilitates this, but does not address political and economic constraints, which for some people might be obvious, but I think for some people bears restating. So how do we get here? I'm going to flag four basic ways we can start moving towards a plant-based food system, but I'm happy to expand on any of these points in the Q&A. I'm just cognizant of the time available to me and the time constraints of the time available to me. So I want to put these out there, talk about them briefly, and then leave as much time as possible in the Q&A because I see that the questions are piling up. So the first and most obvious thing is individual dietary change. I talked about that study in Nature Food looking at British food consumers. Absolutely, the single biggest food system environmental impact an individual consumer can have is moving towards a plant-based diet or as close to a plant-based diet as is feasible for them. This matters for one big reason. Of course, if I eat a steak today or don't eat a steak, that's not going to affect the fate of large-scale meat producers globally. It's not going to change, it's not going to affect global warming. But if we need large-scale dietary change, we need individuals to change their diets at scale. And individual change can be the basis for norm change, which is to say, changing the norms about how we eat and what sort of eating is desirable from a sustainability or health or animal welfare perspective. Vast literature on norm change and social change points to this. In fact, a highly cited paper from Science from a few years ago specifically talks about dietary change as one of these key places where individual change can lead to norm cascades that affects how groups of people eat. And of course, that norm change in turn turns into market signals. So if people are asking for, more plants, more plant-based protein alternatives, those signals will eventually be answered by markets who will provide those goods. Right? If there's no individual change and no norm change, but just some expectation that somehow magically policy will change in order to create a more sustainable food system, I think that we have no proof that theory of change actually takes, especially around changes that involve consumer goods. So step number one, individual change, norm change. Step number two, defaults and nudges. A vast literature in public health shows that, quite simply, changing the default foods to more sustainable options, especially in institutional settings. So for instance, if a university canteen offers Beyond Burgers rather than beef burgers, or offers more plant-based options, or puts those plant-based options as the default, or you make, foods at a wedding default vegan and force people to opt into meat-based options, we know that people stick with defaults. And so quite simply changing the default, or coffee shops switching to oat milk rather than dairy milk. Changing defaults convinces people to stick with the default. If that default is more sustainable and affects a wide range of consumers or buyers, you can start having a real large-scale positive impact. And I'm happy to talk much more about this. A third step that I'm particularly fond of is plant-based protein alternatives. So be it, plant-based meat alternatives like the Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger, bean-based egg alternatives such as the Just Egg, things like this. Of course, dairy alternatives, oat milk, soy milk, and so on and so forth. What these products do, and why I think that they're a fantastic option for shifting us towards a plant-based food system, is they lower the switching costs for that individual change. People are quite change averse. We know that a lot of consumers of food make food purchasing choices based on price, taste, and habit. And so if you ask people to completely change their diet, they might be a little bit averse to that change, especially without those social normative pushes. But if you give someone a burger that's really close to the burger they already want, it's just made with plants, or if you give someone a milk to put in their coffee that's not dairy milk, but it's Oatly, and that does the trick, that foams well in a cappuccino, that, it might sound trite, but what that does is it reduces those switching costs enough that it can push people to start making those individual changes, then those norm changes, and then start demanding those products sort of through market signals. And the fourth issue is, nuts and bolts regulation of the production of animal-based product production. The reason meat can be produced in such quantities so cheaply is because it can externalize so many of its impacts, so many of those harms, without the real price of those products reflecting them. Right? And they can also do a lot of things, such as keep animals in long time confinement that doesn't allow them to express their natural behavior, because there are no regulations preventing them from doing that. So pushing for regulations, this is why I brought up the example of Proposition 12 in California via a ballot initiative, or pushing perhaps for more radical regulations, such as what's been floated in Europe is a meat tax, which is to say a tax that would force meat producers to actually pay some of the cost of their greenhouse gas emissions. These things might be difficult to pass politically, but if they pass politically, then what they would do is they would increase the costs for animal-based product producers, which they'd either have to cover themselves or they'd have to pass on to consumers. And we know from experiments, including recent real-world supermarket experiments in Europe recently, that the more you raise the price for a good to reflect its environmental externalities, the more people, just simply by virtue of price, not by virtue of environmental or animal ethics, are disincentivized from buying the product. And so pushing for regulations of this sort, things that increase the cost of animal-based products at an institutional and political level, are absolutely an important and, in my opinion, necessary lever to both disincentivizing the production and consumption of those goods, but also leveling the playing field, for instance, for plant-based protein alternatives that can compete on price parity that actually reflects real impact. And I'm happy to talk about these more. I'm exactly at 50 minutes, so I'm going to stop now, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience. And I'm also going to stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Dutkiewicz. Obviously, it garnered a lot of attention and curiosity. We have a host of questions that I've had to kind of, in my mind, even group into categories because there's so many great questions. Before we get into the questions, I do want to emphasize that in addition to this talk today, Dr. Dutkiewicz will be doing a full online course, generally on the same topic, but in greater detail for us this coming fall. So keep your eyes open for that. It will launch in October. And so if you just want to go deeper into the subject and equip yourself with the data, with the ideas in a more robust and profound way, keep your eye open for that course. So to get to your questions, there's a number of questions here in the Q&A, and there's a few categories here, and I will start with the first question that came in, but tie it to a theme that came up in a few other questions, which is something you pointed to about this topic of accessibility of food deserts, so to speak. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about what this notion of a food desert is and how we've come to understand it, how it also relates to the health impacts of meatified diets, right? These tend to be related to food deserts and still meatification, and how one questioner asked, like, how can I even speak about this in my community to flag how much it's related to these animal industries?
Okay, those are a lot of questions, so I'll try to break this answer down as systematically as I can. And if I don't address some part of it, you can stop me, or someone in the Q&A can stop me. So first of all, the question of access. So part of this meatification process, I know it's a clunky term, but I think Professor Weiss really sort of nails it with a systematic analysis of this issue, so I keep using it. So part of meatification is not just creating the product, but creating the consumer. A tremendous amount of effort goes into putting, so you've got this superabundance of meat, right? So in the United States, then I didn't say this during the presentation, but the numbers are staggering. In the United States alone, close to 10 billion animals are slaughtered every year for meat. That's about 9 billion chickens and about 1 billion of other food animals we eat, primarily cows and pigs. Setting aside any ethical questions about animal production, right? And looking at this just from a business perspective, you've now got this superabundance of cheap meat, but you need people to buy it. And so there's a tremendous effort that goes into getting this meat everywhere and cheaply, right? And so there's a whole remaking of the American consumer experience. This happens everywhere, from the fact that there's a meat aisle at every supermarket, but even if it's not a supermarket, there are animal products virtually everywhere and in everything. Fast food as a food category relies almost exclusively on factory farmed cheap meat inputs. Processed products such as, for instance, jerkies, cured meats, bacons, et cetera, these are all basically places you can think of for producers to basically cram this superabundance of meat they're producing and get it in front of consumers. And of course, if these products are cheap, then those can become convenience products that that people see as sort of the default option, but those also become the products that exist in places in those more processed, less whole cut forms, in places where people don't necessarily have access to more healthful diets. So you look at what's available at, a gas station, a 7-Eleven, corner liquor store, a corner store, a bodega, what kind of food is available. And you'll notice that a tremendous amount of those foods, those sort of easily accessible foods, contain animal products. And this has a lot to do with the merchandising of these goods that are, as I've mentioned, artificially cheap. Now, how is this related to this question of food deserts? So the food deserts is a bit of a contested concept now in the public health literature, but the short, sort of not contested version without the asterisk is that food deserts are areas, both urban and rural, where there is no source within, depending on the definition, within a certain geographic area or length of time to access through public transit, a site of like a place to buy fresh, whole foods, be it a retailer or a farmer's market or a local farmer or something like this. Right. And we know that a tremendous amount of people in both rural and urban areas, primarily people of low socioeconomic status, reside in places where they rely on a tremendous amount of their food on basically places that aren't retailers of fresh foods. So that's your 7-Elevens, your fast food joints, and your gas stations, and so on and so forth. So that's what a food desert is. Now, food deserts aren't completely determinants of unhealthy diets, but they're a contributor. There are a lot of other aspects, right? Like income, education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's basically it. And the fact of the matter is that all the people who fall into food deserts are massively meatified, right? Like, what can you get? You can get lots of processed foods, a lot of which contain meat, and that's by design. So the second part of the question is, how can you talk to people in your community? I mean, I don't know who's asking this question, so I can't sort of ventriloquize you or members of your community because I don't know where you're coming from. But I think the story I've just told is a very important one. It's not like underserved communities eat meat because that's what underserved communities necessarily want. I'm not saying people in those communities don't like meat. They may very well like meat, but the reason there are so many animal-based products available in those communities where, for instance, you might not be able to get access to a Whole Foods plant-based diet or an accessible Whole Foods plant-based diet has a lot to do with the economics of production that I've discussed, and a lot to do with these merchandising and advertising tactics of really putting that mass-produced meat everywhere. And it also has a lot to do, as an aside, with advertising for particular goods and advertising in general for meat. So just to throw some quick numbers at you, the fast food industry, which is primarily a sort of site of meat, spends $4 billion every year advertising to Americans, a lot of that aimed at low-income Americans and at children and youths. There are also these things called checkoff programs, which are farmer-funded commodity promotional groups that advertise particular commodities. So you may have heard, the pork, the other white meat campaign that's funded by the pork industry to convince people that pork might be a healthy meat, perhaps a healthy alternative to red meat. It is, of course, a red meat, regardless of what this ad campaign says. You've heard of the Got Milk campaign, arguably the most famous advertising food campaign of all time. That food campaign was funded by America's dairy producers to convince Americans to drink more milk at a time of dropping liquid milk consumption. So all of that messaging, all of that sort of a superabundance of background messaging does push consumers toward eating a certain way, right? And I think the more you think about it, the more you become aware of just how ubiquitous that messaging is.
Thank you. So I think we could, like you said, there's so many embedded sub-questions in that general topic. And a lot of the other questions I see here, maybe we can get to them, but they're veering away from, I think, your focus for today. Not veering away, they're just always present in the discussion about environmental impact. So I think I want to at least address one theme here as well. There's a question that talks about, say, given the scale of impact you are talking about regarding drought in the Colorado River, what are politicians in the United States doing to address this situation? There's another question that's part of that, but then later on, we see another question that says, I recently read an article indicating that even if we eliminated all fossil fuels today, we still would not meet our global climate emissions goal to keep temperature increases under 1.5 degrees Celsius. If I could link one more question to that, just so I want to make sure, sorry for some of you if I'm not reading them all verbatim, but I want to make sure that we get them all together. Someone else asks, how do we talk about meat eaters and the kind of cognitive dissonance of meat eaters who are animal lovers? But we might also say, in all these questions, how do we bridge the gap between politicians and everyday people who say they care about the environment, really want to work on the environment, but kind of an ag question is consistently being sidetracked or left out? So once again, I'm giving you a bit to juggle, but I really am talking a lot about how to address the environmental impact in a communicable way, both on the individual level and say maybe, like you're saying, the political level.
Yeah, so going to the second question first, yes, absolutely. That study. There's a study that came out, I believe, 2 years ago that basically says we can't meet any of our climate targets, whatever, be it 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, without addressing the agriculture question. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, per the statistics I showed you, agriculture accounts for about a quarter to a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. A large portion of that is animal agriculture. And so if we're talking about reductions across sectors, across industrial sectors, then we absolutely need to address animal agriculture. Now, why are a lot of these things not covered? Why is this not part of the mainstream conversation? And I think there are a lot of answers to that question. Number one, I think it's an uncomfortable issue, given that a lot of people eat meat, right? Like, if you say, we need to address global warming by taking on Shell and Exxon, people say, yes, good, like oil companies, that's bad. And I think a lot of people, given an affordable option, would, use a heat pump, buy electricity from a utility that uses renewable sources of energy, drive an electric car, so on and so forth. But the switching costs there for the individual consumer in terms of experience are low, right? Like an electric car still drives the way an internal combustion engine car does. You flick the light switch, the lights come on. If that energy comes from solar or wind power, you're great, right? But it doesn't appreciably change your experience of driving or the light being on in your office. Whereas eating is far more personal. And I think a lot of people are very loath to make sacrifices when it comes to their individual behavior. But I think that because of this, because of how uncomfortable a topic it is, things like this, like these big picture issues, like zoonotic disease outbreaks, like the sheer scale of greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture and so on and so forth, are undercovered by the media. There was a report recently from, I believe it was Faunalytics, but don't quote me on that, that basically showed that proportionately, so comparing scale of impact to scale of coverage, agriculture as a whole and animal agriculture specifically were vastly undercovered by the media. And so I mean, part of this is right. I mean, I write about this. I see it as sort of one of my personal missions to actually get these uncomfortable conversations in the media. But I think part of the reason it's not talked about much is because it's uncomfortable for people and it's poorly covered. Now, the question about the Colorado River and politicians, why don't politicians necessarily care about this? I think politicians avoid this question for much the same reason that the media do, for much of the same reason that particular people do. And there's another reason, which I'll get to in a half second, but it's uncomfortable and it's not political. You don't want to be the politician who's going to be accused of banning meat or whatever, right? In electoral politics. We know, for instance, that when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez started speaking about the Green New Deal, part of the Green New Deal's platform was reducing agricultural emissions. It was very vague about how it was going to do this. And right away, she was attacked with claims that she wanted to, take meat out of the jaws of red-blooded Americans. They wanted to, take away your sort of consumer sovereignty, eat meat and sort of. And so which is not to say it can't be done, right? Like Cory Booker talks about this all the time. Right. But there's one Cory Booker, and we just need more Cory Bookers. And but I also think that there's a mismatch there. So the flip side of this is I think when we look at any survey of Americans, there was a recent survey by the Sentience Institute that showed that over 50% of Americans would support legislation banning factory farms, right? When Proposition 12 is actually put to California's voters, people vote in favor of improved animal welfare. And so I think there might be a mismatch for some politicians, not to generalize, but especially politicians in blue states in the US. I think people are reticent to engage with the issue, but I think if politicians leaned into the issue, a lot of politicians in some parts of the country especially would find that there's actually much more support for regulating animal agriculture or talking about improving access to whole foods, plant-based diets than they give it. Now, the second part of this is quite simply regulatory capture and lobbying. Animal agriculture industry, it's a pretty unavoidable fact, contributes tremendously to politicians, especially in agricultural states and agricultural regions, such as the Central Valley of California. And so there is a lot of pressure on politicians to sort of handle the industry with kid gloves and not talk about it and oppose legislation that would regulate it. And I think that this is a case for voters actually, mobilizing around these issues and telling their representatives that these things matter to them. I mean, representatives on some level do listen to the people they represent. And so making your voice heard specifically around real potential regulatory issues, I think is just part of, living in a democratic society. But now looping back to the Colorado River issue, and some things are just entrenched, right? The biggest problem with the Colorado River is that Colorado River water right grants go back historically to the westward expansion of the United States. These are century-old water grants that had much more to do with who gets water than actually thinking about water availability or climate change. And so it's very hard to untangle these old laws, right? It's very hard to untangle old laws that give water rights, in certain states get a certain percentage of water, and then certain farmers have a sort of like use it or lose it access to that water. This is the case of the Colorado. And so it's extremely hard to basically tell farmers to not farm or to farm otherwise. And so there are a lot of these problems that are, not inextricable, but they're sort of Gordian knot complex problems. So for instance, with the Colorado, there's no real easy answer. But with other things like legislation like Prop 12, we've got a clear precedent, right? Put the question to people how you want animals treated, and more often than not, you'll get a positive answer. I hope that hits on some of these answers. Anyway, yes, okay.
No, that's
on some of these questions, sorry.
It certainly has, and there's a lot more. I fear I won't be able to get to a lot of these great questions. But what you point to as well, and related to something earlier, and I want to touch on it in one question here, because someone asks, there's something about education, and there's also a question that asks about cultural constraints, things like masculinity, gender, race, and so on. And I guess a question here when we talk about veganism, or say even policy measures, right? There's ballot measures in Sonoma County, measures in Denver right now about banning slaughterhouses or closing other industries. And some communities, less privileged, marginalized communities, right, will ask this age-old question, like, why is this burden being put in our laps? There's jobs that we're actually getting in these locations. And even if they are sometimes victims of, there's environmental racism, environmental classism, and so on. And so I think kind of the question is, how do you support this transition in a sensitive way that is not maybe so much specifically for a certain slice of the population, if you understand what I mean? How do you make it as kind of like global collective issue and not a sense that we all have to pay for the same situation, even though our differential burden is a race issue, a class issue, and so on?
I have two answers to that question. One is perhaps more sensitive, and one is perhaps less sensitive, right? The first is that absolutely, any question of phasing out a harmful industry in order to replace it with, either replace it with nothing because we can already produce a lot of plants, or replace it with a less harmful one, requires policy, right? It's just transitions, retraining, long-term sort of unemployment insurance, these are all policy issues, right? Like, I think it's very like if someone's a vegan in New York City and someone in a transition to a plant-based system might lose a job in, a processing plant in Montana, it's very hard for the former person to do anything about the latter person. If we're talking about systemic shifts, we need to be talking about policy, about, this is sort of like the bedrock of industrial policy and just transition jobs programs, right? And so that's absolutely a question of politics, right? The slightly less sensitive question is, look, agriculture makes up less than 1% of the GDP in the United States. And animal agriculture makes up a smaller slice of that. For an industry with such tremendously large negative downsides, it's a very small contributor to the American economy, and it's a relatively small job creator, right? And so I think that if we're talking in the aggregate, I think the aggregate benefits, including to all of us, right? So having sufficient water, reducing global warming, reducing the risk of zoonotic pandemics, reducing non-communicable disease harms, I think a case can be made that far outweighs the job numbers. And as I said, that's the more insensitive answer, but I think that that's sort of like the Schumpeterian creative destruction answer. But the answer to sort of bringing those two together has to be policy. A just transition has to be a government large-scale investment policy issue.
Great. Moving on, I'm gonna kind of pivot a little bit. It's an interesting question here from Richard Twine, who's asked, doesn't faith in market signals forget the political economy, i.e. incumbent actors doing things to preserve the status quo? Might a better narrative that could bring together a movement for climate, food, and animal justice be to argue for a decommodified food system? So this is more like a wholesale pivot.
Yeah, I mean, yes, sure. I mean, I agree. I absolutely think that our sort of right to food argument is a good argument. I also think that if we're talking pragmatically, I don't see how in a country like the United States, you start even moving the needle on any level towards a decommodified food system at any meaningful enough scale and on a meaningful enough timeline to make a difference, right? Like, I think whatever solution, what we're looking at in the medium, short, medium term, you have to be working with commodity farmers producing commodity goods, selling those goods through retailers, right? Like through for-profit retailers, meeting consumers where they are. I think the structure of the food system as it stands, while malleable through policy, has to be part of any kind of medium-term food system sustainability solution. If we're being realistic, and that's my honest answer. And that's not an argument against making the argument that undergirds the question, or against movements championing alternative foodways. That's absolutely not the case. I support those kinds of initiatives. But I think if we're talking a country of well over 300 million people who eat at restaurants, eat at five, get most of their food from supermarkets and restaurants, that's like, you have to meet them there, and you have to work backwards through the value chain to meet them there, to meet most people there in the medium term, even if you're working towards other goals, right? Or perhaps not you, right? Like, perhaps different people are working towards different goals. So perhaps if there's a subset of people working in the decommodification direction who might criticize the other direction, I still think that if you're talking about large scale sustainability, you're working within the sort of malleable but not too malleable constraints of the extant food system.
Yes, you and I have actually collaborated on that a little bit, talking about how like this dismantling project has to take place in certain forms in the present. I think this is an issue, right? We see it in, we're talking about food systems, we see it when we talk about veganism in other contexts. You see it right in prison abolition as well. There's ways in which you have to operate under these seemingly two-track solutions, right? A track that is horizon-oriented, and then a track that is people living in the world thrust into a situation with material needs. And a lot of the discussions, especially right in vegan spaces, are about how we get there. And I think what you're pointing to, which seems to be a shift, I think, in some space about veganism as well, is like, look, we actually have to pay attention to history, political science, social science, psychology, as much as we would like it otherwise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I thought that's very well put. And I also think we need to. So I would say that absolutely, but that's a question to be taken very seriously, and I think it's a very serious question. But I think we also need to push back against things that grow out of that sort of question, saying, like, isn't, for instance, shifting to plant-based proteins, just for the sort of further entrenching corporate control over the food system or something like that. And I think that's a bit of an absurd reduction of the point, right? Like, if you look at every single metric and form of harm that I've talked about, suggesting that, if we switch to if somehow, I could snap my fingers and every burger sold in the United States was not a beef burger, but an Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, the sheer, 70% of all beef eaten by Americans is ground beef, right? Like, the sheer scale of that shift in environmental terms would be monumental, right? Even if all this money would now be going to Impossible, which would now, corner the plant-based market, and et cetera, et cetera. So but I think that suggesting, for instance, that given the scale of that impact, suggesting that, Impossible is just a corporation doing evil corporation things and we shouldn't support it, I think, again, misses the scale of the problem and the pragmatics of the solution.
Very well put. In the last, we have a 5 minutes, but I want to give you space for it. I want to ask a question, and I apologize to those who I didn't kind of enfold in the other.
Oh, sorry, can I just quickly get one question from that I saw in the Q&A?
Which one?
The feed additives one.
Oh yeah, sure. Please, I will. I can read that aloud. The question is, what about feed additives like 3-NOP, algae, etc., also vermicomposting? I've been getting a lot of questions about these options when I speak about veganism and sustainability.
So hello, anonymous attendee. You can shoot me an email if you want more sources and not be anonymous after this talk. But this is I wanted to hit on this because I've written about this, and Matthew Hayek at NYU and I have written about this. So as the public has basically slowly started to accept that animal agriculture, specifically ruminant agriculture, is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the industry has pivoted to looking for ways to reduce its greenhouse gas impact. And this has to do with basically doing one of three things: changing what ruminants eat in order to decrease their inherent methane emissions, doing genetic engineering of those ruminants to basically try to breed animals that generate less methane inherently through digestion, or capturing methane from those manure lagoons through these things called biodigesters, which are basically contraptions that capture the methane rather than the methane being released, reroute the methane to be used as natural gas. The number one key thing to mention here is that none of these solutions, the top line answer is that none of these solutions can scale enough to reduce ruminant greenhouse gas emissions anywhere near enough to make them competitive with not just non-ruminant meat animals, but plant-based alternatives. They might be able to make a marginal dent in emissions, but not a large enough dent, right, to actually make these foods comparable to plant-based foods, or as some companies like JBS, which is currently being sued for false advertising in New York State, that you can make cows, quote unquote, carbon neutral or net zero. Specifically with things like feed additives, the headlines and the reality are a little bit different. So feed additives, for instance, like algae, like red algae, which is sort of ground up, added to cows' feed. And when they digest it, it reduces the amount of methane they belch. The numbers on how much methane emissions can actually be reduced vary. But even if we take the very sort of high end estimates, which is like an 80% reduction in methane, you now have to think about where that reduction happens, both in the life of a particular cow and in the scale of the livestock industry. So animals only spend a few months on feedlots, and you can only really get processed feed additives into processed feed on feedlots rather than when they're grazing. And in feedlots, because animals are eating easily digestible processed food, they're actually emitting less methane. So that's an 80% reduction across 4 months of their life out of their total life cycle where they're already emitting less. So it's not addressing any of these higher emissions. So that's 80% of 4 months, right? So this number slowly shrinks to maybe an 8%, not an 80% of lifetime emissions of methane. And then there's the big logistical and political economic question of how do you actually scale algae production and feed additive production enough and convince farmers everywhere across the well over 1 billion cows on the planet to actually implement it, right? Saying that, so these reductions, like once you start zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, the reductions quite simply aren't significant enough to create, a quote unquote low carbon or carbon neutral cow. And that's not to say that they don't actually reduce emissions, but I think that they work much better at greenwashing and sort of giving social license to people to keep eating meat than they make actually significant large scale contributions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants.
Great, and I just want to flag that not only will, maybe this is part of your course that's coming up in the fall, but I do want to let other people know that actually another expert in the kind of general field, Vasile Stanescu, is doing a course for us starting in August on greenwashing and humane washing in animal agriculture. So these kinds of issues of scale and the impossibility of scale, so convincing some kind of small data set or in some very controlled environment, the unscalability is really the huge issue. So just to wrap up, I mean, from Arihanta Institute, we're really concerned with the Vegan Studies program and the Vegan Studies Initiative to understand how for Jains and non-Jains, there's this motivation through kind of nonviolence and compassion. And it seems that in all of your work that's highly well researched and highly well argued, it comes from somewhere. So I guess in closing, I just want to ask, from myself, but from Arihanta Institute, like, are these things that kind of drive you, like a desire, a compassionate desire for a better world, a non-violent world? Because it looks like you're really in the muck all the time. But how do you stay going? And is that part of it?
I don't actually get asked personal questions much, but yeah, I mean, look, I think that on a basic ethical level, the fact that in the country where I work, 10 billion animals are slaughtered needlessly is a tremendous injustice, right? I think quantitatively speaking, it's one of the greatest injustices in human history. But that's a personal ethical question that's separate to some extent from the fact that we have reams of data across all these issue areas showing that this form of food production is fundamentally harmful and irrational, right? Irrational from the point of view of actually feeding people in a way that doesn't poison our waterways and contribute to global warming. And so I think my broad food system commitment is I would just love to have a food system that's produces food within planetary limits and feeds people without all these unnecessary harms and risks. That may sound naive, but I think it's possible. But I also think that that's where the science points. I think if the science pointed me in a different direction than my sort of ethical commitments, there would be a dilemma there. But I think the opposite is true. So yeah, and I mean, as far as like being in I don't know. I think it comes with the job, right? All jobs have downsides. Dealing with this is the downside of my job, but it's also, I mean, this is what my job is. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really want to thank you, Dr. Dutkiewicz, for being here with us, and I hope everyone can give a kind of at-home round of applause to him. I think this was a really powerful presentation, and folks in the Q&A want to know the sources, so you can send them to me. I will distribute them. And I really hope that those of you who are here today will join our online course launching in the fall, and you can tell folks around you about it as well. And you can really do a deep, slow dive into this topic that couldn't be of greater urgency and magnitude. So thank you all for being here. Once again, thank you, Dr. Dutkiewicz, and we will see you all hopefully on July 1st for our next talk in the series with Ed Winters, How to Talk About Dairy. Thank you so much.